In the 1870s, when 18,000 Mennonites were migrating westward to North America from Prussia, Poland, Ukraine, a few others said, no, that's the wrong way. We need to go east. The context for this story are the ancient Silk Road trade routes that went all the way from Xi'an and then Beijing, all the way westward to Western Europe. Our story comes from this region. You see Uzbekistan here, Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva. Our main focus will be Khiva and also a little village named Zedebulak between Samarkand and Bukhara. So they went eastward from Amtrakht in Alt-Samara and from Malachna colony. Here are my figures, my estimates. Some of these numbers were given, others I estimated, family size, for example. So here we had a few more than 100 families, 900 members, family members, 246 wagons. And here you see the weeks and the miles. Can you imagine spending 15 weeks, 18 weeks on this journey that was often terrible? Deserts, old post roads, storms, even ice, and of course, sandstorms. The first destination was Tashkent, or Kaplanbek, which is right next to it. And there they stayed for the winter, 9 months. Now, Mennonites could come to this region called Turkestan. The Russian Empire had just overtaken many of the khanates or the kingdoms in the region, and General von Kaufmann up there was the governor general, and he led the troops to open up all of Turkmenistan and put down all the rebellions. So because of that, he wanted Mennonites to come and serve as a buffer. Yep, once again. They were amazed at the kind of cultures they discovered. Young man Herman Jansen wrote this. This was exotic. And the colors, everything was brightly colored. Their clothing, almost everything. And imagine you have black-clad Mennonites, sober Mennonites, coming into this very colorful culture. And it was a shock for both cultures, multiple cultures on that side, and for the staid, sober, German speaking Russian Mennonites. The citizens were afraid, the Uzbeks were afraid of these Mennonites because, man, there were so many of them. And look at all those wagons. What do they have in their wagons? They had long boxes, which were trunks, and they were quite sure that they had rifles in them, which is what had happened just a few years earlier. Elizabeth Unruh, a 14-year-old who records her observations, and she notices things that none of the adults notice. And yes, the buildings are ornate and colorful as well. Can you imagine crossing something like this? It was often hot. They had to cross deserts, sands. And how do you do that with horses and wagons? They hired camels to cross deserts several times. And many children died. Along the road, joining these graves, were the children of these pilgrims. Nobody under 10 survived the trip. Imagine if you're a woman, you're mourning your children and maybe making a move that you were not in favor of. Yeah, but the man has the say. Here is a special story. This is in the village of Zedebulak. And when Jim Youngke and Sharon Eicher arrived here with their group in 2007, they discovered this mosque, which had been pictured in Fred Belk's The Great Trek. And here they found this place, met these people, and we did also. The two on the left are imams, and on the right, you see a distinguished elder. Inside the mosque, we had holy moments. Here in this mosque and in a tent outside, the Mennonites worshiped, they baptized, they buried, had funeral services for their members who died, and they had baptisms. And here we discover that Johan Jansen rather, baptized Jacob Claassen. And these two families are represented in this. They are reading their journals of their own families, and they discover how they intersect here in a most marvelous way. Here's what Jacob Claassen had to say. Clearly a significant moment. After Bukhara, they again crossed deserts. One source says there were 300 camels who were hired. Another source, Elizabeth Unruh, says there were 405. There were a lot of camels. And they all bundled up. They were put in boxes on, well, their equipment, the wagons they took apart were in boxes on the sides of the camels. Children and women and those who were not well sat in boxes on top. And the men and the boys took their horses by another route. Yeah. Imagine riding atop this. Then they reach, eventually, after a sojourn in Lausanne, which was a disaster, they were invited by the Khan, the king of the region, to Khiva. And here are the gates of Khiva. Outside, you see this large statue of Al-Khwarizmi, who invented logarithms and arithmetic and algebra. Imagine, we thought everything good came from Europe. No, in Central Asia, they were far ahead of us in science and medicine in almost every way you could think of. On the other side of this walled city of Khiva, with many bright and beautiful buildings, you see laid out here the city. And we're going to zero in on this very special place, which is now a Mennonite museum. Amazing. It's just amazing to see what they have done. It's also amazing that they have remembered and retold the Mennonite story so often. As I heard from Jim and Sharon, when they first arrived, they wondered whether anybody remembered the Mennonites. Wow, yes, they did. And they were even planning a museum exhibit to tell the story of German-speaking Russian Mennonites. Sharon Eicher and Jim Youngke, who were the tour leaders for the first tour to this region, and they discovered this story and were amazed by it. And Jim said often that when he taught Mennonite history in the classroom, when he got to this sojourn, he would tell the story of Klaus Epp, and that was it. But now we know so much more of the story. And here in this new museum is the new staff. And second from right is Dr. Karimov, who was the city museum director who initiated the Mennonite exhibit. Here we are inside. And you see arts and crafts, you see instruments and tools. And all of this comes from a village about 11 kilometers outside the city wall called Akhmechet, which means white mosque. When the Mennonites built their village, in the center they had two buildings that were whitewashed, a school and the church. And really at first, the school was in the church. And so the villagers called it the White Mosque, Akhmechet. Displays that tell the story of the Mennonites and the interaction between Muslims and Mennonites. One of the most fascinating things that they have done in their exhibit, they have QR codes so that when you visit, you can take your phone after you've downloaded Nazar, and you can focus on that and you get the story.
In 1935 was house numbers and the names of the families who lived in them. Raisin family, house number 26 to 27. The leader of the Mennonites in the Ak Mosque, Emil Raisin, spoke fluent local Russian and German languages. Muhammad Rahim Khan II invited him to serve as an interpreter and economic advisor. It is believed that Raisin was involved in the transformations of Khiva in such areas as modern postal service, telegraph system.
If I could, I would turn my phone inward so that you could see the visuals, but one must have the camera pointed to it.
In front of us is a village of German Mennonites in Ak Mosque in 1935. Was house numbers and the names of the families who lived in them. Raisin family, house number 26 to 27. The leader of the Mennonites in the Ak Mosque, Emil.
Okay, we'll move on. So they have state-of-the-art technology. I was so impressed. When this museum was to open 10 years ago, 10 years earlier, it was very basic. They had pulled in the artifacts from the Akhmechet village, but their technology was low-key. They have new paintings. Here, Mennonites selling produce. They also sold milk products, made cheese, and so on. They became quite well known, both for their industry and for the products that they made. And here is a replica of the Mennonite family of 1884 or so. Displays about the farming. When we asked the villagers there, or the people in the city of Khiva, why are you interested in these Mennonites? Because they taught us how to farm, they taught us how to build, they taught us how to carve, they taught us so many things. And we are so indebted to them. And almost every day we're there, well, probably every day we're there, we eat products that Mennonites introduced to Central Asia. Tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, and on, including new breeds of cattle to upgrade the stock there. One time we kept pressing the villagers, and you're saying everything that the Mennonites taught you. Well, what did you teach them? Well, eventually they said, well, we taught them how to irrigate. And of course, that was essential in that climate. They were especially well known for their woodwork. When they arrived in Khiva, the Khan, king, Rahim II, gave them work to do. So they helped to build buildings. They were especially known for the windows and doors, which were substantial. They did the ironwork for the latches and the windows and the bars over the windows. They made a parquet floor. The Khan had seen one in St. Petersburg, and he wanted to know if they could make a parquet floor. And so we did. Well, they did. And we can still see the parquet floor there. And here is a school bench remaining from the Mennonites who lived there, taught school there, learned their ABCs. Here's a model of the village. And in the center, you have the church and the school. And it is now an open field. And before us, ahead of us, is a pear tree that lives still, that Mennonites planted. And they know everything that Mennonites brought them and did for them. And so we ask more questions. Every time we ask more questions. When the bus arrives in this village, everybody comes out of their houses. They come out of their schools, students and teachers, and we have a marvelous time exchanging gifts and conversation as much as we can. Okay, that's the end. I'll stop here. Sandra, you're muted on my screen.
Sorry about that.
Good.
Just before we get to participant questions, there's a few in the Q&A. Just a reminder that if you do have a question for John, please put it in the Q&A so we see it. If you just want to chat about something or make a comment, you can do that in the chat section. John, I know there's a really good story about back in the 1880s, how the Muslims in a particular village welcomed the Mennonites. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. That was the village of Zedebulak where you saw the mosque. Mennonites were stuck there for a winter and a summer. And the villagers invited Mennonites to use their mosque. Can you believe that? Some of the families actually moved into the mosque. Others made do with donkey stalls outside in the courtyard. And in the summer, they had a tent that they spread out over the courtyard. And Muslims gave this hospitality in just amazing ways. The last time we were there, a merchant, the elder of the village, invited us to his house for tea. That was the first time we'd been in the house. And as we were eating and drinking tea, he said, you know, when the Mennonites were here in 1882, my ancestor was a merchant. And when they left, when the Mennonites left the next spring, my ancestor gave them money and gifts. And I said, why? Well, it's taught by the prophet. It's in the Quran. It's Muslim duty. And also, it's also Uzbek, they said.
That's amazing. I heard that they even let the Mennonites perform weddings and other ceremonies in the mosque.
Oh, yes, they did. Mennonites used it on Sundays, and the Muslims used them Friday and Saturdays. And by the way, if you can see behind me, you'll see a red prayer rug. That was given to me by the Imam at Zedebulak. And of course, I treasure it.
That's wonderful. Okay, we're going to go to some participant questions. John Yoder is asking, why were the Mennonites leaving Russia? What was the attraction of the East?
All right, so let me go to a slide that I have prepared in case that question came up. Here are some motivating factors. Let's see, am I sharing the screen?
No, not yet.
Can you see it now?
Nope. Just hover at the bottom, find the share screen, and then pick the one.
I thought that's what.
There we go.
You see it? Okay.
Yep.
So here are 7 factors that I put together. The one most commonly talked about was escaping Tsarist military conscription. Russia had withdrawn the exemption they had given Mennonites when they came to this place from Prussia in 1789. They also wanted new economic opportunities, manage their own affairs and education, seek first the kingdom of God, and to escape the great tribulation in the West and prepare for the imminent millennial rule of Christ in the East. They were convinced this would happen in the East. And when 18,000 Mennonites, or at least one segment of Mennonites, were going to North America, I think it was Abraham Peters, who said, blessings to you and safety and God's best to you, but you're going the wrong way. You need to go east. So that was also somewhat logical. They went from Holland to Prussia to Russia to Asia and generally eastward. And then they had an enthusiastic invitation from General von Kaufmann, who spoke German as well as the Mennonites did. And of course, that was a comfort, and they loved him. Unfortunately, he died soon after they arrived, and they did not have the benefit of his care.
Thank you. But he was an Uzbek governor, correct?
No, he was a Russian governor.
A Russian governor.
The Russian government had taken over much of Turkestan, Central Asia. And so he was the general of the armies. And then when they had conquered the lands, he was the governor. So he was the powerful man next to the Tsar.
Well, and someone else is asking, how long did the Mennonites stay and why did they leave?
Okay, good questions all. When they got to Tashkent, they separated. About half went northeastward into the Talas Valley, which is Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And the other half went south because Klaus Epp, among others, insisted that south and east, or south and west, was the way to go. And that there would be the New Jerusalem, and they would prepare for all the refugees that would flee the tribulation in the West. When they finally got to Khiva, after essentially 4 years of wandering, they struck up this good relationship with the Muslim neighbors. They were valued, they had good relationships. But in 1834,
1934.
The Soviets sent Russians there to make an inventory of everything they had, what they were doing. And the report said, among other things, they give us no time. They even do not use our school books, and they won't accept any funds for their schools. 1935, a year later, they were deported.
Wow. So that was the end of the Mennonite settlement, and that was from Akhmachet?
Yes. They were deported to Tajikistan in village number 7, they called it.
Wow.
When I interviewed Tralgat Queering, who was 80-some, maybe 90 when I met him, he was a 3-year-old on that trek. And so I said, tell me about village number 7. And he filled me in. It was very difficult. Many died. In addition to plowing the land to grow crops, food, they had to build their own shelters, which they did at night. So they worked themselves essentially to death.
Wow. Wow. Okay, I'm going to go to some more questions here. About the museum that's in Khiva, John Yoder is asking, how's the museum supported?
Early, it was supported by Kaufman Museum and donors who had been on the trek.
Oh.
In addition to whatever city funds that get scraped together.
Right.
When we returned last year, we were told that the government, a new president, because yes, Beverly Dunn, you said the first time we went there, it was locked up. We could not see it. It had been finished, but we couldn't get in because the government shut them down. Dr. Karamov said, yeah, we'll keep everything. When we get a new president, we'll open it. And that's exactly what happened. And the new president gave grants to mosques and villages and churches and museums because they wanted to showcase how tolerant they were of various cultures. That includes German-speaking Russian Mennonites.
Wow. Speaking of languages, Kevin is asking, how are the language barriers overcome during the trek?
You had some quick studies. You had some young men who learned it very well and eventually became interpreters for the Khan in his court. Herman Jansen, Johann Bartsch. They learned it quickly. They wanted to learn it, and they did, so they translated for their parents, and they got really into the culture.
And what language is it that they would have been learning? Was it?
Uzbek, Sart, and Russian.
Okay.
And maybe a few others.
And Dora is wondering, did the Mennonites who did that trek, did they pick up any of the food and clothing and cultural markers from Central Asia that they maintained?
Essentially, no.
No, okay.
They brought the culture to the region.
Okay.
Fascinating enough, these plain segregated Mennonites brought the modern world to Central Asia.
Wow.
Including photography, for example. Wilhelm Penner was a photographer, and he taught a young man how to use the camera, then gave him the camera. And this man went on and developed, and he became the father of photography and cinematography of Uzbekistan.
Wow. Yeah. And it wasn't that large of a group. How many families was it that did the Great Trek from Russia to Central Asia?
1,100, 100 essentially, for easy memory, 111. Total.
Families.
Yes, families.
And how many people would that have been approximately?
900.
900.
Other
Wow.
estimates had it at 600. I did some estimating based on the figures that we knew, and it was 900, almost 1,000.
Wow. Such a small group to have such a large influence.
Yes.
Hmm.
They grew, of course. So there were 200 families eventually, and up in the Talas Valley, there were 200 families, and they grew and they managed. And by the way, up there, and it also happened after the deportation, local villagers, everyone was forced into the Soviet work army. That happened all around the region. So yeah, they had it bad too up there.
Right.
Hard work. They moved back and forth some. Some migrated to Khiva area, Akhmechet later. Some from Auliyata and some from Akhmechet moved to Auliyata.
Depending on who they were fighting with at the time and who was mad at who. And
Well, it was the Soviet suppression. It was all Soviet.
Okay. And Julie is wondering if there are still any Mennonites in Central Asia, in modern day Uzbekistan.
We find only the descendants of Mennonites. And they know their story.
Huh. And so had they intermarried that?
No.
No. Okay.
Well, eventually, after the deportation, after the Russian-Soviet struggles, then some did intermarry. And by the way, there was one intermarriage in Akhmechet, in this Mennonite village. I had heard bits and pieces of a story. So one year I was in Europe, I went to visit a family who had been there, who had come from there. And we were sitting around the dinner table and I was asking questions. And I said, by the way, I've heard rumors that there was a man and a woman who had an affair. The older woman, seated at the table, said, that was my grandfather.
Wow. So was it a Mennonite man and a Uzbek woman? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Of course, he was excommunicated. And when she got old, he took care of her. When he got old, his family took him back and the church took him back in.
Wow. And Chris is asking where the Mennonites went. So you already said that some were forced to go to Village 7 in Tajikistan.
Yes. And that's about, maybe 60 kilometers north of the Afghan border.
But then there was also a group who left in the 1800s still, wasn't there?
Yes. In 1884, about half the Akhmechet families had had enough. And they left from Lausanne, which was a disaster, and went to North America. Those who stayed thought they were deserting them and were unfaithful, and the feelings weren't good. But some had had enough and went to North America. Some settled in Newton, some in Beatrice, Nebraska.
Okay, so Kansas and Nebraska they went to. Okay. And just looking over the questions, what were some of the last names of the Mennonites who went east? You've mentioned a few, Birch.
Queering, Jansen. Well, let me go to my list.
While you're going to your list, a few people are asking how long Akhmechet was around.
50 years.
50 years, okay.
50 years, yes.
And it looked like the Uzbeks had quite a good model of the village.
Oh, they did.
They must have had photos before it was destroyed.
Oh, yes. And people remembered. Yeah, there were a lot of photos. You had photographers among them.
course.
Documented a lot of it. Okay, so here's a document. Here you see some names. Assuming you're seeing my screen.
Yes, but we don't see the names yet. We see the your slideshow.
Okay.
Maybe just read them from your list, the list you have.
Okay. We had Funks, we had Barches, Jansens, Penners, Peters, Queering. What are some of the other ones here? Peters, Taves, Wall, Klassen, Schmidt, Bergen, Bronnen, Dirks, Kook, Kraker, Pauls, Peters, Nachtigall, Schmidt, Esau, Gertz, Graves, Weens, Weedle, Unruh. You have them all.
That's a big variety. We have, oh, somebody's wondering if there was a Friesen, and we have a great-grandson of Elizabeth Unruh here.
Yay! What's his name? Larry?
That is Doug Berg, says he is the great-grandson of Elizabeth. And then we have a relative of Peters, Abraham Peters as well.
Alan.
Yes, Alan.
Yes, that's great. Wonderful. Tell your stories.
Yeah, feel free to post your stories in the chat. I'm going to keep going on the questions here. Gary Smucker's wondering if the people were led by a prophet expecting the second coming. That is a story that's out there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story?
Yes. They were all expecting the second coming of Christ. There was teaching in all evangelical churches in Europe about the second return of Christ, imminently, soon. And there was a novel written by literary guy, and it was read by everyone, especially by Mennonites, because the two principal characters were Mennonites. And so they flee to the east, they flee the Antichrist, they have terrible experiences, but the east is where they need to go.
And so that was that work of fiction was something that stimulated people thinking about the end times and the second coming.
Oh, certainly did. And many were believing that and thinking that and getting ready for that.
Wow.
Already back in Prussia, that teaching was alive and well. Franz Barth wrote that the millennium and the end times became the topic of every Sunday's sermon.
Wow.
That became the most radical. He eventually departed from the others, was shunted off to the side. He was essentially excommunicated. And he's the one who then fixed a date for the second coming. And Alan has a story about his great-grandparents, I believe, who noticed this.
Is that true, Alan? Maybe you can type in the chat, Alan. And Leon's asking, what did they eat and drink on the journey?
They bought things along the road. They had a very rough postal road to follow. Sometimes it went right into the desert and they had to hire camels, but they would eat fruits and melons and buy flat bread and buy vegetables. And they over and over and over expressed their excitement and astonishment for the huge, sweet fruits, melons especially. They just raved about it. And we know why, because we ate some when we were there.
That probably confirmed to them they were in the promised land, right? Seeing all those gigantic fruits, and they thought they were on the right track.
They also had to buy hay and oats for their horses.
Of course.
Sometimes that was a problem. And of course, finding water in the desert.
Oh, yeah. And Elena is wondering how they coordinated their departure from South Russia and East Russia.
The two communities that made up the 5 wagon trains met together, and they did this planning for quite a long time, because everybody was being caught up in this great migration fever, as one of them put it. And so they were in this together. So there were 5 wagon trains that went from the Russian Empire to Ethiopia.
And Alan Peters makes the point that there were 2 Mennonite groups that made the trek in the 1880s. The larger, more publicized group was led by Klaus Epp, but a smaller group from Malachna was led by my great-great-grandfather, Elder Abraham Peters.
Abraham Peters, yes.
The 2 leaders negotiated for a while to join forces, but could not agree on many details. And so the Malachna group settled near Aliada, now, and you mentioned the Talas Valley.
Yep.
And established 4 villages there.
And yes, they had arguments all along the way about the end times and about Klaus Epp's increasing fanaticism.
Right.
He had a strong personality and was able somehow to convince people that he was right over and over again. And he would write letters. He was in the last wagon train, the 5th one to leave Russia, and he would write weekly letters. He would sign it Uncle Klaus, and he would say, to the church in Kaplanbeck, I write, reflecting Revelation language.
Wow. There you go. Irene is wondering about resources to look into genealogy. Irene, we will send out links to that kind of material in our follow-up email. And Dora is wondering, have the diaries mentioned been published? So has Elizabeth Unruh's diary been published? And the other one is by?
Clausen, Jansen. There were, if you go to the Bethel College website, to Mennonite Library and Archives, and if you send them my reading list, you'll see all the diaries that they have. And there are many, which is wonderful for learning the story. Not all have been translated from German to English. And I don't know that any have been published for the public. It's mostly family.
Okay.
But especially marvelous is Elizabeth's, because she notices everything, and she writes from the point of a woman and a young woman.
I've read that one myself. It is absolutely beautiful, and her experiences are stunning. I think the family member of Elizabeth Unruh, you guys should get on publishing that. It's well worth letting the public read. And so we will send a link to any resources as well in the follow-up email, where you can maybe find some of those diaries. You mentioned Bethel College. We'll put that in the follow-up.
And Canadian archives have more than we do in the US.
Okay. Okay, that's a question about intermarriages we answered. Okay, and you mentioned the surnames. Does the museum in Khiva have regular hours? Does the museum have appropriate support from the local authorities? You mentioned that. So is it open most of the time?
And they've also asked if they could bring a traveling exhibit to North America.
Wow. That sounds great. And did you say yes, sure, and work it out with Kaufman Museum?
Absolutely. And I want them to partner with Kaufman Museum to plan a schedule and a tour and events.
That's a great idea. Lynette is wondering if Mennonites did any proselytizing, and did Mennonites convert to Mennonites convert to Islam?
No.
No, they stayed pretty
They knew
separate.
little about each other's faith expressions.
John is asking what the tribulation in the West was that they were trying to avoid.
It was chaotic. How can you have a democracy and survive. It's all chaos. There's no king. There's no queen. And Dutch, Prussian, Russian Mennonites had a long history of negotiating with kings and queens and bishops. A democracy, it made no sense to them.
Ah,
That the Antichrist would surely come from that chaotic place.
wow. And Dorothy's wondering if any of the Mennonites returned to Russia.
There was travel back and forth. What has happened more recently, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many Mennonites, many have become Baptist from Central Asia and from Russia, have moved to Germany. There's been this broad migration of Aussiedler. And many of them have the Central Asian experience.
Oh. Okay, but were they wouldn't have gone with this migration, or did they?
No, this was, we're talking 1991 now.
Right.
Aussiedler to Germany. And other
But was there time in Central Asia because they were banished?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, they were all a part of that. Some came from the banished village of village number 7. Others came from Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, where all the Mennonites were disowned. They lost all of their properties and all of their businesses because the Kyrgyz said, we need to own these. These are ours.
Right.
The Mennonites left without anything.
Wow. And Gary's wondering what percentage of the group ended up in North America?
Well, I can only speak about the early years between 1882 and 84, and then 86, and even a bit later. Families kept migrating to North America.
Right.
About 23 families left Lausanne, their disastrous settlement, and went back to Europe, back to Russia, and then Germany, and then North America. So at least 23 families in this one move, but there were others who trickled in or trickled out after that.
Now there's a few questions around how did they see going to North America? Was it a triumphant thing? Did they feel defeated and discouraged and like failures? What was the feeling?
Ask somebody from Beatrice. They will tell you that they were looked on as failures, as second-class citizens. And they were even shunned. And I've spoken to Karen Schmidt, are you on? Who said her parents in Beatrice warned them not to date any Klaus descendants. And there's still this fear and this inferiority complex.
Wow.
Which could have been broken. And I think for some it was broken after the 2007 tour. And they heard all this other stuff, the many different stories. It wasn't just about Klaus Up.
Wow. Beverly's saying there were Silk Road trails, but there were also railroads from 1880s through to Soviet times. They were in Russia and Ukraine.
Yes. They came, apparently, well, some were there going east and west, and more of them came after they arrived in 1884. So yes, there were trains that came.
Okay. And those who traveled to Kansas and Nebraska and other points in North America, how did they travel? How did they get there?
Wagon trains once again. They packed up their wagons, hitched their horses, and went over terribly rough terrain to get back to Orenburg and then back to Germany, and eventually to the coast and by ship to North America.
Dora was wondering what they had enough of, and just listening to you, I'm picturing going over mountains and rough terrain in a wagon. I think I would have had enough of that, and your children dying, and
ravines and mountains. It was sometimes terrible, and crossing rivers. Sometimes they hit sinkholes. But the big problem in Lausanne, before they got to Akhmechet and Khiva, was the thieving Turkomen, who, for them, it was an honor to steal something if you could. And of course, Mennonites were non-resistant. So the parents did not allow their young men who would have defended themselves from reacting to them. And so they stole horses and cows until there was hardly anything left.
Sounds like the perfectly bad situation with people who felt honor in stealing and those who wouldn't resist.
Absolutely. So there are some amazing stories, but they were attacked right. And what really put them over the edge was when Abram Peters, not related to Abram Peters, was killed when they came in the window to the house to steal his wife because they said she was beautiful. He stood there and got, I don't know, 20 sword cuts and knife cuts, and she escaped out the window.
Wow.
So that was the last straw for about half the group.
Wow. Wow. Okay, we're going to be wrapping up here. We've got a couple last comments, and then we're going to call it a night after lots of fabulous questions and really digging into this unusual migration story. So Alan says, young Stilling was the author of the book.
Yep.
Heimweh.
Heimweh.
Homesickness, which declared that the Millennium Kingdom would be established in Central Asia. That was the main reason that the Peters Group migrated east. Many of the Peters Group migrated to North America between 1893 and 1903. My grandfather insisted that his parents leave in 1903 because the current governor in Turkestan was beginning to insist that the Mennonite boys enlist in the army.
Yep. And when they left the Russian Empire, they were fleeing conscription. And there were some young men eligible for it. So they tried to get across the border away from Russian territory. And they went back and forth several times trying to keep their young men. But conscription was the big deal.
Right. Wow. And Alan has one last comment. During the Stalin years, many of the Central Asia Mennonites were forced to move and work in the mines near Alma, near Olyata, I think he means.
Olyata, yeah.
Many of them have since moved to Germany, where they become part of the larger Mennonite, the group you mentioned, Umsiedlers groups in Germany. Okay. Great. John, did you want to make any final comment before we wrap things up?
May I ask a question? Can I go another 30 minutes?
You've got so much more to tell. So if you haven't had enough of this story and you want to hear more from John and just pump him with questions, you could send him an email, or better yet, tell Audrey of TourMagination that you want to go on tour with John, and in coming years, we'll plan another tour to Uzbekistan, and you can see the awesome museum at Khiva, meet people who still remember the Mennonites, or their families have told them about the Mennonites.
And by the way, the elder host, Imam in Zedebulak that I talked about first, insisted that the next time we come, we stay all day for a traditional festival and stay overnight in house. So this is amazing hospitality. So if you go on the next group, we will plan for that.
Sounds wonderful. A great intercultural experience, interreligious experience. Sounds awesome. Thank you so much, John, for your presentation, and everyone for joining us this evening.
Yes,
it was wonderful.
All.
Good. All right. Good night.